Father Peter will undoubtedly wonder where he got himself to, that the priest brings his golf clubs to Mass. I'm glad you're laughing, because the topic, of course, from the readings is marriage and divorce, and it's not an easy topic. Because if you heard some of that, Jesus is not pulling any punches. But if you allow me, let me offer you a little bit of background, and let me share with you a little bit about what the church teaches. It may not be what you think. And so perhaps by the time we get to the end of this, you'll feel maybe a little better, or at least have a way forward. The background's important. When these guys ask Jesus this question, is it okay to divorce? That's actually a bit of an unusual question. Normally, what was asked of rabbis in that day was, what are the reasons? When's it okay to get a divorce? In other words, the idea of divorcing was an acceptable practice because it was in the Jewish law. But there was a lot of debate over what was valid grounds for divorce. Some rabbis thought it was, you needed to do something awful, adultery, for example. It had to be very serious. Other rabbis on the other end of the spectrum, if your wife burnt your food, that was plenty reason to divorce her. So you could see there was a lot of debate, discussion about this, and they're just trying to get Jesus to weigh in on it. Undoubtedly, he surprised them. And he quotes this passage that you heard in the first reading, the story from Genesis. And he says, hey, this whole divorce idea, this was not part of God's plan. And reminds us about that story. Adam and Eve, the two will become one flesh. And the idea that marriage is this inseparable union. But the thing you got to remind yourself is that Jesus looking at that story is a good thing, but that story happened before the fall. It happened before Adam and Eve sinned. In other words, Jesus is pointing to a time and a place when everything was perfect. And so it makes a lot of sense that any marriage that would have happened in the Garden of Eden would have been a perfect marriage. There was no sin. But you and I, we live in a fallen world. And many of you, probably the vast majority of you, have been affected by divorce. Either your own, your parents, or someone close to you who has suffered a divorce, and perhaps that has hurt you deeply. So you appreciate the fact that sin has entered the world and has made it difficult, if you will, to live out this ideal of Jesus. So what do you do with that? I mean, are we off the hook, so to speak? Well, Jesus, that's okay if we're living in paradise, and we're not, and so anything goes? Well, you wouldn't think so. And this is where I really think the church can be quite helpful to us. To understand how the church looks at marriage, how it understands marriage. The church does hold that the marriage is an inseparable bond. But you have to understand how that bond is formed. When the married couples in here, when you, on your wedding day, stood and faced your beautiful spouse, you said the vows, the consent, as the church calls it, and basically you said, I choose you. And those three parts are important and all have to be true. So you have to be in a position to make this lifelong commitment. I don't know if you would know this, but if I ever get ready to officiate a wedding and the groom shows up, just as an example, rip-roaring drunk, I am not permitted to marry him. I cannot pretend that he is able to make that decision. He's not in that state. And even if there's 100, 200 people waiting for the marriage to start, I have to wait as long as it takes for that guy to sober up. Because if he makes the vows in a state of drunkenness, they would not be valid vows. And so, you need to be in a place where you are able to make this commitment. And choose, it's got to be a free choice on your part. No pressure, no force. And you have a right, of course, to know who it is you are being joined to. Who is this person in truth. And when those three things are all valid and all true, the church does believe, yes, an inseparable bond has happened, and that there is no way that that should be divided. Now, you do have to be careful here, though, because divorce in our society is a legal matter. It's just legality. When you stood and were married, that was in part, if you got married in a church, that was sacramental, but part of that was legal. Because you were married, you have certain rights as a married couple. And the divorce that you got from a judge was also a legal matter. All it said was, you no longer have those rights. You're no longer married. But in the eyes of the church, that legality stuff, that's important, but those are legal matters. In the eyes of the church, just because you are no longer living together, you are legally divorced, the eyes of the church says, well, but you are still joined together. As Jesus says, the two have become one flesh, even though you're not living together. And that needs to be honored. And so where things get a little complicated, a little tricky, is this idea of someone who has gotten a divorce and then wants to remarry. Well, can you do that? Well, that's where an annulment comes in. And most people don't really know much about annulments. They've heard bits and pieces, and a lot of that is incomplete, sometimes wrong. All an annulment seeks to do is go back and look at that moment when you stood and exchanged your vows, the consent. And the church is simply asking, were all three things true? The I choose you? For example, many of you would know examples where people were forced into a marriage, an unwanted pregnancy, for example, or a friend of mine got married because, frankly, he married the last woman that he thought would marry him. And that's not a choice. He got sort of his pressure on himself to get married. Some people do. They feel pressured by the family. And if it's not a free choice, even though you said it, and even though it looked very good, the church is going to look at that moment of consent and say, you were legally married? Absolutely. But you were never really bound in the way that Jesus is talking about to this other person. Same thing about the you. I choose you. Any number of annulments I work on are basically about that the spouse hid something important from the person when they were in their engagement. One man, for example, knew that his fiancée wanted to marry a good Christian guy, and so he pretended to be a good Catholic Christian, went to Mass with her week after week after week until they got married. And as soon as they got married, he dropped all of that and was no longer a good Catholic guy. So she basically gave consent to somebody who wasn't there, if you will. And so that bond was never made, and so that bond was invalid. And so if you find yourself in a position where you have gotten a divorce and either are considering remarrying somebody or maybe have already done it, all I can do is encourage you to make an appointment with Father Anthony and I, stop in, let's talk about it. Because it is likely, highly likely, that something wasn't right at the very beginning. And some annulments are very simple and easy. Others, I will admit, are long and a little complicated, but it all can be done. And then you would be able to move forward and say, okay, that marriage had some good parts to it, wonderful things, perhaps, that came out of it. And certainly the children, they're all legitimate and all that kind of stuff. That's all true and wonderful. But because I was never really bonded to that person, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to sort of put some finality to that, put that behind me, and then maybe the marriage I'm in, maybe we could have that marriage in the church and maybe form that bond that Jesus wants. Because if you think about it, is that not a beautiful thing that Jesus wants us to aspire to? That a man would leave his father and his parents, a woman leave her home, and they would join together and they would create something new two would become one flesh. They would have this union that they would live out. And their love would be an example to all of the world, their community around, their love for each other. It would be an example like Christ loves the church. So many good things in it. And so, again, all I can do is encourage you. My hope today was simply to provide some information I would have told you if you had made an appointment and sat down in the office. But if you would be so kind, if you're interested in this, again, make an appointment. We just listen to your story, find out kind of what happened, and then see what can be done. And generally, almost always, something can be done. And that would hopefully then move you along in your spiritual journey, draw you closer to God, certainly, but maybe even to your spouse. And so I hope you don't hear these readings as Jesus condemning you or anything like that. Jesus, as he always does, just wants the best for us, and he wants the best for us in marriage.